Thousands of fans stood locked outside the stadium, and the most powerful woman in women's tennis governance had finally reached her breaking point. This was no mere scheduling oversight. It was a pattern. Repeated, documented, and utterly inexcusable. A pattern that had been unfolding in Melbourne, in Miami, in Dubai, and at every venue where Alexandra Eala dares to appear as the most talked-about player on the planet. And when someone with the influence and platform of Jessica Pegula decides to speak out, you don't simply have a controversy on your hands. You have a reckoning. Stay with us because by the end of this you'll understand exactly how deep this goes. To grasp the fury, you first need to go back to the beginning. You cannot understand Pegula's frustration, and you cannot understand why millions of fans worldwide are furious at the WTA right now, without first understanding who Alexandra Eala is and what she has done to this sport in the span of just 12 months. Alexandra Eala is 20 years old, born in the Philippines, and she did not arrive quietly. In March 2025, entering the Miami Open as a wildcard with no ranking clout and no seeding to her name, Eala unleashed one of the most breathtaking runs women's tennis has witnessed in years, dispatching Jelena Ostapenko, then Madison Keys. One after another she beat Iga Swiatek, the two-time defending world number one. Match after match after match on the grandest hardcourt stage outside of the Grand Slams, she kept winning. She kept dismantling players ranked above her. She kept turning commentators into believers. By the time she walked onto the court for her semi-final against Jessica Pegula, she was no longer a wild card in spirit. She was the story of the tournament. She was arguably the story of the entire 2025 season so far. Pegula won that match, but not without a battle. And even in defeat, Eala showed the tennis world something it hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine, electric, can't-look-away excitement. The numbers that followed her everywhere told you everything. In a fan poll on Talking Tennis, 79% of tennis fans picked Eala as their favorite over Coco Gauff. 89% preferred her over Emma Raducanu. She wasn't just popular. She was transforming the very demographics of who watches this sport. Filipino communities around the world were buying tickets, booking flights, and staying up until 2 in the morning just to watch her play. Wherever Eala went, people followed. Full stop. So here is the question at the heart of this entire story. If you had the most popular player in women's tennis, a player selling out venues, generating headlines, and bringing millions of new eyes to your sport, what would you do? You would give her the biggest court. You would put her under the brightest lights. You would showcase her every single time. The WTA did not do that. And that is where everything begins to unravel. Because what happened next is when things got truly unbelievable. It is January 2026, the Australian Open, Melbourne Park. One of the 4 most prestigious tennis events on earth. Alexandra Eala, fresh off a historic 2025 season, a Miami Open semi-final run, a first-round US Open win, the first Filipino in history to win a match at a Grand Slam in the Open era, and a rapidly rising ranking, arrived at Melbourne Park for her first Australian Open main draw debut. This was a milestone moment. Not just for her, but for an entire nation, and for the millions of Filipino tennis fans who had followed her, cheered for her, and wept with her through every twist and turn of 2025. Melbourne is home to one of the largest Filipino communities of any city in Australia. People had been talking about this match for weeks. Supporters had made travel plans. Some had driven hours. And then the Australian Open released the order of play. Eala versus Alicia Parks. Court 6. Court 6. Not Rod Laver Arena. Not Margaret Court Arena. Not even John Cain Arena. Court 6. A mid-size venue with limited seating and no roof. Sitting inside Melbourne Park like a quiet corner of a neighborhood you'd walk past without a second glance. The reaction was immediate. The queue that formed outside Court 6 stretched so far back that it passed Rod Laver Arena, one of the most famous tennis stadiums in the world, and kept going. Hundreds of people, then thousands, shoulder to shoulder in the afternoon sun, hoping and praying they'd get inside. Many never did. They were forced to gather around large screens outside the court in overflow areas that were, by the way, also packed beyond capacity. Fans who had traveled 12 hours from Sydney just to be there in person ended up watching their hero on a television screen in a car park. The internet did not hold back. The WTA should have done their research better. They know Eala's appeal and should have pushed for a better stage, one fan wrote. She should easily be on an arena court, posted another. One commenter simply called the decision dumb and said it would be unforgivable if it ever happened again. On Reddit, stories spread of Filipino fans who had never attended a tennis event in their lives, who had come specifically and solely because Eala was playing, being turned away at the gate. And this was not a one-time mistake. That is the critical thing. The Australian Open incident was not an isolated case. It was the latest chapter in a story that had been building for over a year. Throughout multiple tournaments in 2025, Eala had been consistently placed on secondary courts at awkward time slots, despite drawing some of the largest crowds anywhere on tour. At the Miami Open, her semi-final against Pegula was not treated as the marquee match of the day in terms of scheduling, despite overflowing stands. In Dubai, the WTA was caught in a scheduling contradiction so glaring that even they were eventually forced to correct it. After fierce fan backlash, they finally placed Eala as the last match on center court on February 17, the most prestigious slot in the sport, and immediately received praise for getting it right. One outlet literally headlined their piece. The WTA Tour finally makes correct Eala scheduling decision after fan criticism. Read that headline again. Finally, after fan criticism. Not through common sense. Not through business logic. Not through a basic reading of ticket sales. It took a wave of public outrage to push organizers into putting their most popular draw on their most visible stage. And then, even after that correction in Dubai, the WTA stumbled again, scheduling Eala to open the evening session in the quarterfinals rather than closing it. Analysts and fans were quick to point out the ripple effect. Aryna Sabalenka's crowd for the match that followed would be gutted. Sabalenka, a former world number 3, a 4-time WTA 1000 champion, a player of immense stature, would be walking onto a court being emptied by the departure of Eala's fans. Back in the Philippines, the rescheduled time slot meant Eala's supporters would be watching past 1 in the morning. One scheduling decision and it hurt multiple people. That is what happens when you have no coherent strategy for managing your biggest star. And now, finally, visibly and publicly, someone with real power was paying attention. Because Jessica Pegula wasn't just a top player watching this from the sidelines. She was the chair of the WTA's own Tour Architecture Council. And she was about to make her voice heard. Let's talk about who Jessica Pegula actually is in this story, because she is not a bystander. And she is not simply a rival. She is the most uniquely positioned person in all of women's tennis to speak on this issue. In early 2026, WTA Tour Chair Valerie Camillo appointed Pegula to lead a new 13-member panel called the Tour Architecture Council, a body specifically tasked with reviewing the women's tennis calendar, scheduling practices, ranking point rules, and mandatory participation requirements. Pegula was chosen, according to Camillo, for her thoughtful and collaborative approach, and her 6 years on the WTA Player Council. She is not just a player with an opinion. She is the official voice of players in the conversation about how the WTA structures its decisions. And Pegula, to her considerable credit, had already been speaking up about systemic problems long before this moment. She and Madison Keys had publicly called out the WTA's grueling calendar, a schedule so relentlessly packed that in Dubai in early 2026, 25 out of 43 main draw players either withdrew before the event or retired mid-match. Pegula herself withdrew from Doha to protect her body, then turned around and won Dubai playing 5 matches in 5 days. She knows the physical cost. She knows the organizational dysfunction. She has lived it. So when Pegula saw what happened to Eala again, she was not starting a new conversation. She was continuing one that the WTA had been refusing to fully have. The court 6 placement at the Australian Open, the repeated relegation to secondary stages, the failure to treat the most popular player in women's tennis like the asset she so clearly is, these were all symptoms of the same broken system that Pegula's council had been created to fix. The backlash this time was different because it had a name behind it. Not just fans on social media. Not just Reddit threads. The chair of the WTA's own reform panel was looking at the Eala situation and saying this is not acceptable, this has to change. And the WTA could not simply scroll past that. But here's the part that nobody is talking about. The real reason this controversy exploded the way it did. And it has everything to do with what is truly at stake for the future of women's tennis. To understand why this matters beyond the outrage cycle, you have to understand what Eala represents as a business proposition. Tennis participation in the United States alone rose to 27.3 million in 2025. The global audience for women's tennis is growing. But growing it further, particularly in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, particularly in markets the WTA has historically struggled to penetrate, requires exactly what Eala provides naturally, organically, and without the WTA spending a single dollar on marketing. A star that a massive, passionate, deeply loyal fan base will follow anywhere. Filipino fans do not need to be convinced to love tennis. They already love it. They love it because of her. They traveled 12 hours from Sydney. They stayed up until 1 in the morning. They queued for hours outside Court 6. They bought tickets to Dubai and filled center court in a way that Coco Gauff, one of the greatest young players in the world, noticed and commented on publicly. Gauff literally apologized to Eala's fans in her post-match interview for making them wait so long. The risk here is enormous, because Eala's fan base is not a passive audience. When they feel disrespected, when they show up in their thousands and are turned away at the gate, they do not quietly go home. They post, they organize, they push back, and they remember. The Australian Open scheduling incident generated international coverage. It was picked up by major sports outlets around the world. And it became a conversation not about elite tennis, which is extraordinary, but about institutional negligence from the very body that is supposed to be growing the sport. Pegula's intervention shifts the entire dynamic. Because now it is not just fans demanding accountability. It is the WTA's own reform chair, a top 5 player, a woman with a seat at the table, saying we need to do better by this player and by this sport. The question is whether the WTA listens before the damage becomes irreversible. This story is not finished. The Tour Architecture Council is still in session. The 2026 season is still unfolding. Eala is still climbing. And the next time a scheduling decision needs to be made, the next time an organizer looks at the draw and decides where to place the player that thousands of people have already bought tickets to see, that decision will say everything about whether women's tennis has genuinely learned from this moment, or simply chosen to repeat it. Was this a simple mistake, or a reflection of how the sport truly values its non-Western stars? Leave your answer in the comments. We want to hear what you think. The bottom line is this. Alexandra Eala is not just a rising star. She is a cultural moment. And Jessica Pegula, by speaking up through her platform, her position and her voice, made sure that moment could not be quietly buried beneath the next order of play. The WTA has been given its chance to get this right. Whether they take it is the question that will define the next chapter of women's tennis. If this video gave you something to think about, and you're following the Eala story and want to be the first to know when the next chapter drops, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover every controversy, every comeback, and every moment that women's tennis doesn't want you to see. We'll see you in the next one.